Oxymoron. Oxymoron is a word that means a figure of speech in which apparently contradictory terms appear together to define something. What are some examples of oxymorons? We've heard these. Civil war. Definite maybe. Friendly takeover. If you like zombie movies, Living Dead. Open secret, plastic silverware. And working vacation. We can laugh at these, but history's biggest oxymoron has a modern holiday named after it. Though it was first observed, they think, as early as the 4th century, it was in 692 AD when the church officially recognized the Friday before Resurrection Sunday as Good Friday. Have you stopped to think, what is good about this day? What is good about this day? We're going to open our scripture and bounce all over the Gospels today, taking a look at what took place on this day. What we observe as Good Friday began in the late hours of Wednesday night with the Last Supper, and then a walk to the Garden of Gethsemane outside of Jerusalem, where Jesus took his friends, his disciples, and went to pray. In the very late hours of Wednesday or very early hours of Thursday morning, Jesus was arrested by the temple guards and the Sanhedrin and taken to the Jewish high council. And that's where we pick up in our text tonight. Matthew 26, verse 57, and then verses 59 through 63. Then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At the last, 2 came forward and said, "This man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days." And the high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" But Jesus remained silent. And the high priest said to him, "I charge you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Mark 14, 62 through 64. And Jesus said, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." And the high priest tore his garments and said, "What further witness do we need? You have heard this blasphemy. What is your decision?" And they all condemned him as deserving of death. Jesus is arrested after being betrayed by someone who had been pretending to be a friend. He was betrayed by a kiss. And when he was arrested, he was hauled by the temple guards into the city of Jerusalem, into the inner court of the temple, to the place where the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, met. And they set up witnesses against him to try and get people to testify in a way that would allow them to accuse him of a crime worthy of death. But with all of the people that they put in place, no one could get their stories straight. Finally, in frustration, the high priest confronts Jesus and asks him directly about his claims to be the Son of God. Jesus not only finally answers him, but then told him that yes, he was the Son of God, and they would see him seated at the right hand of power and authority next to God's throne. This was enough, as Jesus clearly claimed to be equal to God. Matthew 26, 67 and 68. Then they spit in his face and struck him. And some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you?" They took Jesus to the Romans then and recommended a death sentence. The temple guards and the Roman soldiers started spitting on him and beating him. They did their best to debase him. They spit in his face and they slapped him. Two very humiliating things. Next, they made a game out of their abuse. They found a cloth or a bag and put it over his head. And they'd take turns punching him in the face and in the head, and then demanding, "Prophesy to us, you Messiah. Tell us who hit you." Being spit on is disgusting. Being slapped is embarrassing. But if you've never been truly punched in the face or punched in the head, it's not like the movies. In the movies, we see our heroes get just beat to pieces, hit several times, and yet they always get up and stagger forward like Rocky and win the fight. And that's just not the way it works. You don't have to be hit in the head that hard more than once or twice before you start getting dizzy and confused and lose the idea of even where you are and what's going on around you. That doesn't have anything to do with whether or not they break a cheekbone or an eye socket or a nose or a jaw in that physical abuse. All of this takes place with the Jewish High Council, the Sanhedrin, watching on. As morning comes Thursday, they've had their sport, and the Sanhedrin and temple guards drag Jesus before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor over Judea, and accuse him of breaking a law that is deserving in Jewish law of the death penalty. Pilate questions Jesus and finds nothing about Jesus worthy of execution, but the Jews were insistent. So Pilate, like any good government bureaucrat, pushes him off on someone else. The king of Damascus and Judah and Jerusalem, Herod Antipas, one level below Caesar, was in town. One level below the emperor was in town, was in Jerusalem at the time. And so Pilate sends Jesus to Herod, the man who killed John the Baptist, and says, "I need your wisdom in dealing with this." And Herod questions Jesus for a while, and Jesus refuses to answer him. No responses at all. Herod finally gets tired of this and wipes his hands of it and sends him back to Pilate for Pilate to deal with. Mark 15, 6 through 15. Now at the feast, Pilate used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked. And among the rebels in prison, there was one who had committed murder in the insurrection, a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do what he usually did for them. And he answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. But the chief priests had stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, "Then what shall I do with the man you call the king of the Jews?" And they cried out, "Crucify him!" And Pilate said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But yet they shouted all the more, "Crucify him!" So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Pilate found nothing in Jesus to condemn him to death. But the Jews were close to rioting, and again, like any good bureaucrat, the last thing he wants is problems. So he caves in to what he doesn't believe, releases Barabbas, and sends Jesus with his soldiers to be prepared for crucifixion. John 19:1. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. What does that mean, flogged him? The whip that the Romans used wouldn't have been a long Indiana Jones kind of whip. It wouldn't have been a cow or a cattle whip that you're using to scare an animal and move forward. It would have been short-handled with shorter strands, less probably than 3 feet long. And in those multiple strands on that whip, they would have had bone or metal sewed inside of the ropes with the goal that those would tear the flesh. So not only would they beat him, but it would rip the skin from his back, opening muscle and bone to view. There was an idea from the Romans that 40 lashes from the scourge would kill a victim. So they'd stop at 39, with the victim barely alive if he lived. Torn, bloody, and broken. Matthew 27 and 28. And they stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and put a reed in his right hand. After they'd mostly killed him from the lashing, they dressed him up as a king. They took that purple robe that Herod had sent him back with and put it back on him. Have you ever had a cut and had a piece of your clothing dry in that cut? It's really uncomfortable. His entire back would have been completely, utterly devastated. And that fine cloth of that purple robe would have dug into all of those torn areas. And eventually that blood would have dried in there, securing that thing to his back in a painful way. And then, because he's a king, he needs a crown. And so they took a plant called Euphorbia millet and wove it into a circle. It looked like this. They weren't just little rose thorns. They're long. And they jam it on his head, and it would tear skin all the way down. And if you've ever cut your head, you know that it's a bleeder. And it hurts. And then they take a reed and they put it in his right hand, because every king needs a scepter. Verse 19, chapter 19, verse 3 of John. They came up to him saying, "Hail, King of Jews!" And they struck him with their hands. Matthew 27:30. And they spit on him and took the reed and struck him in the head. John 17 or 19, 16 through 17. So they took Jesus and they went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. The Roman cross is made up of two pieces. The long piece, the vertical piece, is called the stipes. And the crossbar is called the patibulum. Now the stipes, unlike most pictures we see of Jesus carrying the cross, the stipes would have been permanently set in the ground on the hill. The criminal would have been required to carry that patibulum, that long, heavy crossbar. It would have been about 2 meters, about 6 feet wide. and would have weighed between 70 and 100 pounds of the roughest wood. And they would have put that on his open back. This picture shows a nice covering of a robe. It didn't exist. Chances are, at best, he had his loincloth with him and that robe. And they put that heavy thing on his back to tear and dig into that open wound. Matthew 15:21 through 23. And they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. And they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, which he would not take. Myrrh mixed with wine would deaden the senses some. It would deaden some of the nerves. It would have made him somewhat drowsy to help him endure just a little bit what he was about to go through. And Jesus refused it. Our Lord chose to experience all of the cross that night. Matthew 27:35 through 37. And when they had crucified him, they divided his garments among them by casting lots. Then they sat down and kept watch over him there. And over his head they put the charge against him, which read, King of the Jews. To crucify him, they take off all of his clothes and lay him down across that patibulum. And then through the wrists, they drive a wide-headed spike through here, through the hollow you can feel right here if you push, which would hold him and hold his arms out like this. And then they'd lift that up and hang it on the stipes. And then they'd take his feet and they'd nail 2 spikes, one through each foot, again with those big heads so that his feet wouldn't come off. The pain from this in the nerves of his wrists and his feet would have been excruciating, sending fires of agony through him into his brain. And this didn't kill him. If a victim was crucified upside down, he'd go on for days like this. They didn't have days. They only had hours because Passover was coming. The pain and torture of the cross was that you couldn't breathe. When you're slumped down like this, the lungs just can't get air. So you'd push with those feet on those spikes and you'd pull with your arms and you'd inhale air and then you'd slump back down. And then that trapped air would start to cause explosions in your head and in your lungs because it needed to be released and it couldn't because you were trapped and suffocating. So you'd pull and push, expel the bad air, and then take more good air, and then slump down again. And you do this over and over and over for hours. And while he was going through all of this, they continued to mock him, rejoicing in his suffering. Matthew 27:39 through 43. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "You said you would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." So also the chief priests and the scribes and the elders mocked him, saying, "He saved others, but he cannot save himself. This is the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now if he desires, because he said, 'I am the Son of God.'" This all took place Thursday morning. Matthew 27, 45 and 46. Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, which translates, my God, why have you forsaken me? About noon on Thursday, whether as a result of an eclipse or just the supernatural power of God, the sun was darkened. And it stayed that way for more than 3 hours. And about 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out in the loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me? Loved one, that's the worst part of the cross. That's the worst part of the cross. From as long as there ever's been long, before eternity, before time, the Trinity was in perfect harmony and in perfect union, in complete and absolute relationship with each other. But God cannot experience sin. He is holy. He is perfect. And so when He placed the sin of the world on His Son, He had to remove Himself from that relationship. And for the first time, the Trinity, the unity, and the harmony was broken as the Son of God took on the sins of the world. And of all of the pain and suffering that He dealt with until now, it was that loss of relationship, that absence of His Father's presence that caused Him to cry out. Shortly after this, they watched Him die. Matthew 27:50. And Jesus cried out with a loud voice again and yielded up His spirit. Knowing this, knowing all of this, how can we call this Good Friday? It's because that death should have been ours. That death is what I deserve. That death should be mine. And it's not. And that's how we call this Good Friday. If you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and the Lord of your life, and you believe that He died on the cross for you and was raised from the dead, not an academic belief, but that deep, most inner part of you, then this is a good day. Because what I deserved, the penalty that should be mine, the penalty that should be yours, was carried for somebody else. Isn't that good?